Hello, everybody. I'm Aaron Porras, and thank you for joining us for ILTV's weekly program, One-on-One with Alan Dershowitz. We want to give you, our viewers, the chance to have your questions answered by Professor Dershowitz, one of America's greatest legal minds. He's a leading expert on criminal and constitutional civil law and civil liberties and the Arab-Israeli conflict. Hi, Professor Dershowitz. Thank you for joining us.
Hi. Thank you.
All right, so to start our first question, it comes from a criminal lawyer and regular viewer of the program, actually, Ami Baran. Let's hear what he has to say.
Hi, Alan. This is Ami from Israel. I'm a criminal lawyer born and raised in America, trained in the UK, and practicing in Israel, but have served as a prosecutor for many years and within the Israeli police. So I can see things from many perspectives. I've been following your show, and I'm very concerned about the threat not only to America's Constitution, but to fundamental elements of the legal system, such as the lawyer-client relationship based on confidentiality. What direction do you see this taking? More importantly, is there a rope to climb down before the situation becomes a full constitutional crisis that blows up in our faces? And by the way, I'm sure you're happy about the Red Sox great start this year. And do you see them going all the way?
Well, of course, I went to the Red Sox opening game at home, so I've been following them very closely, and I think they have a good shot at going all the way. Look, I think we're going down a very, very dangerous road, both in the United States and in Israel, by trying to criminalize political differences, by trying to get one's political enemies through the vehicle of criminal law. And I think both sides have to stop doing that. All sides have to stop doing that. We have to stop doing it in the United States. We have to stop doing it in Israel. And if you don't like a political candidate, vote against them. The response should come from the ballot box, not the jury box, or not from the judge. So I think it's a very dangerous slope, and I hope we'll be able to avoid moving down it.
All right, now moving on, I'd now like to introduce our studio guest today, Professor Uzi Rabi, who is the director of the Moshe Dayan Center for Middle East and African Studies at Tel Aviv University. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Pleasure.
Now, Professor, one of the top stories is the fast-approaching May 12th deadline by which President Trump has asked European leaders to either fix or nix the Iranian JCPOA nuclear agreement. So this and the inflammatory remarks, of course, recently made by the Iranian leadership in response to Trump's threats to resume sanctions. So how do you view Trump's options and what should be done, what could be done? How do you see this playing out, Professor Rabi?
Well, that's definitely the most, I would say, pressing issue when it comes to our calendar in the Middle East. I think that what Trump is doing is to let the Iranians think on themselves, by themselves, and have them actually have a second thought about many things that were taken for granted. So basically, I see this, I see all these as kind of a positive step on the right direction. The issue is, what are they going to deal with? First, when Trump is dealing with Macron and Angela Merkel, and then with the Iranians or to the Iranians. Are they going actually to reopen the agreement and to deal with some of the clauses, or use this situation, which has become, for me, or in my eyes, a golden opportunity to start dealing with items out of the agreement, like Iranian actually hegemony in the region, the ballistic missiles. Maybe it's not definitely dealing with the clauses of the article. It could be used as an instrument by which to put a halt in front of Iran and create kind of a more stable Middle East via that. We'll have to wait and see. What we know is that some of the European states are very anxious about the, let us say, total violation of the conflict, and they are coming to Washington, D.C. in order to persuade Trump to have something which is in the neighborhood of sanctions light.
So, Professor Dershowitz, I want to ask you about that too. What are we expecting to come out of this meeting with Macron and later with Merkel? What is Trump hoping to get out of this, and are his hopes realistic?
Well, I have no idea what's in President Trump's mind. I can tell you that I think the best resolution would be not to necessarily tear up the deal, but for President Trump to re-articulate what Iran said at the prologue to the deal, in which it said Iran reaffirms that it will never, never under any circumstances, seek to develop or acquire nuclear weapons. If President Trump were to say, and get Macron and all the other signatories to say, that is a crucial part of the deal, and that includes not only developing nuclear weapons, but acquiring the capacity to develop nuclear weapons, getting enough centrifuges spinning so that they could transfer or transition from civilian use to military use, that it is the policy of the United States and the policy of the other signatories to the agreement that Iran will never, even after the sunset provisions kick in, will never be allowed to develop nuclear weapons, and that the United States and the signatories will take whatever action is necessary, including as a last resort, military action, to prevent Iran from ever acquiring nuclear weapons. You can do that within the four corners of the deal if you focus on the words of Iran itself in the prologue to the deal.
Let's see. Now, of course, if we're actually talking about Iran, we inevitably then have to talk about Syria, including how Russian, Iranian, Lebanese, and Turkish interests align. So, what's going on in Syria, and what are we to make of that situation, Professor Dershowitz?
Well, what's going on in Syria is a great failing of the United States government under President Obama, when he didn't follow through with his red line, and he created an opening for the Russians to come into Syria. The Russians now are entrenched in Syria. They've just threatened Israel that if Israel tries to shoot down their air defenses or destroy their air defenses, there will be consequences to pay. We're now in a very, very serious escalation when it comes to Syria, and it's the fault, tragically, of the foreign policy, or really the foreign ideology, because Obama didn't have a foreign policy. He just had an ideology, but the foreign ideology of the Obama administration. It's a terrible tragedy. President Obama will go down in history as the Neville Chamberlain of the 21st century because of the way he mishandled Iran, the way he mishandled Syria, the way he mishandled the entire Middle East.
I see. Professor,
yeah, I totally agree. I think that what happens in Syria is kind of a byproduct of an American failure or American mishandling. And basically what we can look or see while looking at Syria is to take Syria as a microcosm of the whole Middle East. Ankara Conference, which dealt with Syria, was compiled by Russians, Turks, Persians, no Arabs, no Americans. In a way, this is something by which to epitomize the whole geopolitical chessboard of the Middle East, and basically Syria is kind of a case to the point. Of course, when it comes to Israel, there are direct dangers or threats that could be seen in the southwest of Syria, but I guess that it is high time to let the American reconsider staying in the Middle East, at least partially, in order to make sure that the corridor, which is compiled of Kurds, Sunnis, even into Jordan, would create kind of a wedge or drive a wedge in an Iranian continuum that is being stretched from the head of the Persian Gulf to the eastern flank of the Mediterranean.
So you're saying that.
Great.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Please, Professor Dershowitz. Yeah.
I completely agree. I think the United States must remain in Syria. I hope President Trump will reconsider his statement and keep American troops there to maintain an American presence and to accomplish the results we just heard from our distinguished colleague.
If Trump were to pull out United States forces from Syria, as he has expressed that he wishes to do, how confident are you that that would result in a vacuum like the one that resulted in ISIS? And do you think that another terror organization like ISIS would be the one to appear, or would Iran fill that gap?
Well, nobody has any idea. That's just something that's so speculative, but we know the gap will be filled, and it will be filled by enemies of Israel.
I see. Yeah.
Well, I think that to some extent, actually, the gap was filled in by Iran. It is in Iraq, it is in Syria. And let me remind you, when the Iranians actually thinking of this Middle East, for them is actually dream comes true, because it has to do with kind of a Middle Eastern empire. And we should remember, it's not only militias, it is also soft penetration. The Iranians are purchasing lands, telecom, electricity, both in Iraq and Syria, and it means that they are here to stay, and one should take it into account because this is a very tough client here.
And if they're here to stay, they're here to stay with Russian support, which makes them even more dangerous.
Definitely.
All right. Well, on that note, let's change our focus now and move a little bit south. The 6-week-long March of Return on the Gaza border has now passed the halfway mark, and while the number of protesters has been consistently dwindling, the impact is still significant. Casualties can still be counted in the dozens, and Israel is still Israel is still being accused of excessive force. So how do you see this situation unfolding in the weeks to come, Professor Dershowitz?
Well, this is an example, once again, of Hamas's dead baby strategy. It's been using it now for years. Every so often, it starts a battle in which it puts its babies and children and women on the front line in order to have Israel kill them so that they will get positive publicity and will get people canceling trips to Israel, as we've recently seen. Israel should do a better job, should be better prepared for it, and should be able to respond to it in non-lethal ways so as not to fall into the trap set by Hamas. So I think it's Hamas's fault, but I think Israel could do a far better job in not playing into Hamas's dead baby strategy.
Well, Professor, how would you how would you address this massive uprising on the border with less excessive force? If you'd like to.
I'm not a military expert, but I do think that rubber bullets exclusively and not using live ammunition, but trying to use non-lethal responses is probably the best way to go. But again, I'm not a military expert, so I can't tell you when it's necessary to use lethal force. All I can tell you is that the results do not help Israel's image in the world and among American Jews as well. So Israel has to rethink the way it deals with these violent demonstrations.
I totally agree with Professor Dershowitz, but I would take it or just emphasize another perspective. What I think that we see in defense of Gaza is kind of a very desperate, highly desperate Hamas. I think that this is one of the last voices of what I call the Palestinian state. They snoozed and they lost, and basically this is something that should tell us that Hamas has no other choice but to ignite people and bring them to the fence after having been defeated with the rockets and with the underground tunnels.
Well, Professor Rabi, do you think that in that same vein, then, will we see maybe an increase in violence towards Nakba Day, towards the end of these protests, or any sort of special kind of culmination of these demonstrations?
There are many in Israel who are very, very afraid and anxious about what's going to happen in May, because we're going to have a very hectic calendar.
Sure.
Remember that we have the 12th of May with Trump's decision about the deal, Iranian deal. We have the 14th of May, which should be again the transfer of the embassy, and the Nakba Day of the 15th. So basically, we have a very, very hectic schedule. But I say loud and clear, Israel is very, very strong. It should be kind of a state that speaks and acts in a way that the others in the Middle East would get kind of an idea of what Israel could do. We wouldn't like actually to do that, but we have to deliver the message. This is exactly what we did in T4, and Israel took responsibility
against
of that.
The Iranian airbase, you mean?
Definitely. Yeah. So what I'm trying to say here is that Israel in this Middle East is going to always be the other state, but this is not to say that cooperation with Saudi Arabia, Egypt, insecurity, economy, etc., are actually could be. They are not could be underestimated. This is something which is very, very important. There are shifting alliances when it comes to states like Iran or even groups like Hezbollah and Hamas, who still entertain themselves in the idea of demolishing Israel. This is the only way by which to put a halt in front of them, and I hope that together with the Americans and with a kind of a constructive dialogue with Putin or Russians, we could definitely build up kind of a front for a more stable region and for a better Israel, safer Israel.
All right, now to finish off our tour of the Middle East, if you want to call it that, Can you both share maybe a few thoughts about how countries like Qatar and Saudi Arabia play a role in the Middle East and how their issues are related to Israel and the region as a whole? Professor Dershowitz, you were actually in Qatar, I understand, a few times recently, so why don't you start off?
Twice, once to lecture at the Northwestern University and once to meet with the Emir. I think Qatar's role is in flux. I think there are efforts, I tried, others tried, to get Qatar to change its policies and to stop the kind of defamations that go on in Al Jazeera, and also to help with the return of the bodies of the 2 Israeli soldiers and the 2 Israelis who are still there. It's still a work in process. I hope that people who go to Qatar could help persuade the Qatari government to do the right thing and to stop its support of terrorism, which it had done over the years, but it's inconclusive. It's a work in progress, and I don't know what the end result will be.
Well, I would take Saudi Arabia, on the other hand, as to show what I tried actually to argue in my former argument. MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, a 33 years old guy who is the heir in Saudi Arabia, but basically a very dominant figure.
Sure.
If we are following closely the way he actually articulated himself in terms of the Middle East and Israel, I think that leaders like him are bringing Israel to its, I guess, kind of an optimum in the Middle East. You don't have to like me, but you have to acknowledge my strength. You would like to be willing to cooperate with me economically or whatever. And basically, with such leaders who understood that the main fierce foe of them is Iran, not Israel, bring us to understand or get some idea about 21st century realities in the Middle East. This is something that Israel should strive for. We have that with Jordan, we have that with Egypt, some of them would say Morocco, Bahrain, United Arab Emirates, all of them are Sunni Arab states, anxious of the Iranian plan,
hegemony,
and definitely they have many fields of accommodation and common denominator with Israel, even if it could be put in my enemy's enemy can be my friend.
I see. All right, well, before we go, we have a special treat for you. As you know, the U.S. Embassy will be moving to Jerusalem on May 14th, 2018, 70 years to the day after the state was declared. Now, we dug into our archive and we found a jewel of a dialogue between Alan Dershowitz and former New York Mayor Rudy Giuliani. Let's relive this moment from the first days of Trump's administration, well before the decision was made, and you'll see the insights were truly prophetic.
Here with my buddy Alan Dershowitz. We just had a wonderful meal, and I want to ask him a question.
Well, first, tell us what your opinion is.
Well, first of all, I'll tell you my opinion. My opinion has been, since the time the legislation was passed back in the 90s, that the American embassy should be in Jerusalem. But I want to ask Alan what his opinion is and what the implications of that would be.
So why don't you ask him directly?
Alan?
Well, I think the embassy of the United States should be in West Jerusalem, but I think it has to happen in stages. I think first the United States ought to announce that it rejects the Security Council resolution that implied that the Jewish quarter of Jerusalem and the Western Wall are not part of Israel. Second, I think the United States ought to negotiate with its allies, the Saudis, the Egyptians, the Jordanians, the Emirates, and get them to agree that putting the embassy in West Jerusalem doesn't pose any problems for Islam, and there's no reason why there should be any objection to it, because of course West Jerusalem is and has been the capital of Israel since 1948.
Mayor?
Sounds like a very rational, sensible approach to what is a difficult problem. Being impulsive, had I been president, I probably would have done it immediately without all the wisdom of Alan Dershowitz. But if I had been smart enough to call him, I would have followed exactly the program that he outlined.
So now a more important question. Yankees or Red Sox?
Yankees.
You know, when I found out that Rudy Giuliani was a kid from Brooklyn who rooted for the Yankees. I knew he'd end up being a prosecutor. Dodger fans became defense attorneys. Yankee fans became prosecutors.
Mr. Mayor?
I think they're still behind us by how many World Championships? Let's see, about 24?
2-1. But that one, 1955, made my decade.
Okay, one. Can I see a piece, between the two?
Yeah, we can make peace.
We can make
We can have
Okay.
The Dodgers no longer.
Yeah, we can make peace.
Yes. So if a Red Sox and a Yankee fan can make peace,
Anybody, and look, come on.
Israelis, the Palestinians.
Maybe you and I should do the resolution. Now we'll tell them what to do.
That would be good.
okay, thank you.
All right, that's all the time we have for today. Thanks for your time, Professor Dershowitz. And I'd like also to thank our guests, Ami Baran and Professor Uzi Rabi. Now, if you'd like Professor Dershowitz to answer your questions, please go to ILTV or our Facebook page and submit them. We'll see you next week.